Welcome to Artificiality, the podcast by Helen and Dave Edwards from Sonder Studio. We created Sonder Studio to empower humans in our complex age of machines and data. Our research-based, design-oriented consulting and education services help you and your organization work better with machines and data. You can learn more about us at getsonder.com. Weather forecasting is fascinating. It involves making predictions in the complex natural world using a global infrastructure for people who have varying needs and desires. Some just want to know if they should carry an umbrella today. Others want to know how to prepare for a week-long trip. And then there are those who use the weather forecast to make decisions that can have significant, even critical consequences. We also think weather forecasting is an interesting topic given the parallels to what we are experiencing in AI. Weather forecasting and AI systems are black box prediction systems supported by a global infrastructure that is transitioning from public to private control. In weather, our satellite industry is transitioning from publicly funded and controlled to private. And in AI, the major models and data are transitioning from academia, which we would argue is essentially public given their interest in publishing and sharing knowledge, to corporate control. Given this backdrop, and the fact that Helen is an avid weather forecasting nerd, we talked with Andrew Blum about his book, The Weather Machine, A Journey Inside the Forecast. The book is a fascinating narrative about how the weather forecast works, based on a surprising tour of the infrastructure and people behind it. It's a great book, and we highly recommend it. Andrew Blum is an author and journalist writing about technology, infrastructure, architecture, design, cities, art, and travel. In addition to The Weather Machine, Andrew also wrote Tubes, A Journey to the Center of the Internet, which was the first ever book-length look at the physical infrastructure of the Internet, all the data centers, undersea cables, and tubes filled with light. You can also find Andrew's writing in many publications and hear him talk at various conferences, universities, and corporations. At the end of our interview, we talk with Andrew about his current research, and we're very much looking forward to his next book. Andrew, thanks so much for joining us. We're really looking forward to talking to you.
Thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to it as well.
Why don't you start off by telling us what inspired you to write this book?
This book about weather forecasting, The Weather Machine, came out of a pretty specific experience in the fall of 2012 when my previous book about the infrastructure of the Internet had just come out, and my son had just been born. He was about 6 weeks old, and I was holding him, sitting with my phone on Twitter, was kind of as I spent most of my time doing it that season, when all of the kind of meteorologists that I followed began to freak out that something called the weather models, which I didn't know anything about, were indicating that a storm, which didn't yet exist, it wasn't like you couldn't go see it out in the ocean. It was really a function of these weather models, was going to turn towards New York City. And that was the storm that then became known as sort of Hurricane or Superstorm Sandy. But what was absolutely remarkable to me and kind of what stuck with me was the fact that they kind of all, and at the same time, got news of a storm that didn't exist with this incredible weather forecast that turned out to be accurate. That was itself incredibly consequential. And being a kind of writer about technology, about infrastructure, being very much in the mode right then of kind of looking for another big infrastructure to write about after I'd written about the Internet, I was completely taken aback that the weather forecast was something I, had more than a passing interest in, was kind of passionate about, as some of us are, belonged to this system or was part of the system that I knew almost nothing about. And when I went to look to read more about the weather models, I couldn't really find anything. They seemed to be these ultimate black boxes that were then, supported by this incredible global infrastructure. And so that piece, those sort of combinations, sort of abiding curiosity on my own part, a kind of huge societal impact, and then a global infrastructure behind it, really kind of added up to what seemed like a great sort of book-length exploration. And the book itself, I guess, came out 7 years after that. So it's a bit of a journey from there.
I love this book, and I'm a complete, we're the nerd.
Yeah,
Some
when you're
people
talking
are.
about being passionate about weather forecasting,
Yeah.
you're talking to one of the ultimate passionate weather forecasting people here.
Yeah, but in, the thing that blew me away about it, is exactly what you sort of described. That this moment of realizing, I read about all these models, and the forecasts are presented to me in a variety of different formats, like really cool apps, right through to the forecasted scientific discussion. And yet I hadn't taken that next step of really understanding all of these models, other than the odd article that you might read in the Conversation or the New York Times about how someone, it's time for a data update, And so, and I found this book buried in a shelf in Powell's in Portland, rather than recommended to me on Amazon, which is another thing that surprised me. Like, I'm going to have to go buy it again on Amazon just to, correct the algorithm so I get more books. So it was a real hidden gem for me, but so fascinating and on point. And there were a few things that I thought would be really fun to just allow you to talk about from the book that that sort of struck me, that I think kind of are real interesting things for sort of anyone, even if they're not particularly interested in weather forecasting. I can't imagine that.
Me neither.
But there were a few things, and one of the first one was just how forecasting has improved in such a linear way since essentially the 70s, and almost like its own kind of Moore's law, if you like, and just how you thought about that yourself and how you wrote about that, and maybe you can just sort of describe that predictive accuracy change. I think that's really interesting.
The predictive accuracy change is kind of easily summarized as a day a decade. So the 5-day forecast today is as good as the 4-day forecast 10 years ago, is as good as the 3-day forecast 20 years ago. What that functionally means over my lifetime is the kind of 2-day forecast in the 80s, is now the 5 or 6-day forecast, which is remarkable. And has resulted, there are extremes like with Sandy where you have a really accurate 8-day forecast with a hurricane. But generally speaking, on a Monday, you kind of know what the weather is going to be over the weekend in most places. How that came about, it's an expansive story, but fundamentally, infrastructure is made by people. Infrastructure is a kind of human endeavor. And so while it seems to be this kind of, giant incomprehensible machine, it's in fact kind of put together by hand, essentially operated by hand. There's a lot of math and algorithms kind of, inside of it, but even those are kind of, written and fine-tuned, by hand. And so when you talk about kind of, what's driving these improvements, it means that each successive instrument on a satellite, launched every few years is better than the last one launched a few years before it. The ability to incorporate the observations from that instrument improves year by year. It's not just a given. It has to be kind of assimilated, as the meteorologists say, into their computer models carefully. And then the part that I think that I kind of love the most, and I think is the most successful, is the way in which the models improve. And there's a kind of basic sort of daily science experiment. The great thing about weather models is predictive tools is that you can build a model, take the observations from today and let it spit out the forecast for the next few days. But you can also tweak that model and then put the observations not just from today and again, but from all the previous days that you have observations in. And so you have this kind of incredible ability to improve. Because at every moment you are not only running it again against the ever increasing future, but you also have all the data from the past to sort of train it as well. So you have a kind of daily guess that is either confirmed or not. And then you have this sort of ongoing effort on the part of a relatively small pool of people to improve that guess each day and to continue to tweak it again and again and again with kind of overall results that are incredibly self-evident. The sort of top line of a day a decade is remarkable, with lots of sort of finer grained things about the way they measure that or the way in which, we're predicting thunderstorms or predicting different kinds of, ocean events or things like that.
That was a huge aha for me. That was one of the things that really jumped out at me, is the whole process of assimilation and the fact that you can essentially go back into the past and make your predictions, test the models based on very fine-grained measurements of today based on yesterday.
Yeah, well, it's a lot easier than a presidential race where you can have other predictive sciences, where you only have whatever it is, 46 presidential races, with bad data from all of them. The advantage the weather has, while being incredibly complex, is that it does come every day. And so you can, and is different globally. So you have the kind of limitless ability to have a hypothesis and then some verification or not of your hypothesized future.
Yeah, that I hadn't really clicked to that, and I found that a fascinating part of the story, and what that this interaction that happens between the different individuals who have a particular specialty and want to have a particular hypothesis, a particular new equation to add in. Can you describe a little bit about how you observed that process happening in sort of real life?
Yeah. In the world of weather modeling, or at least 6 or 7 years ago when I was doing the bulk of the reporting for this book, there were kind of two games in town, and it was either you focused on the Americans, loosely around the National Weather Service, there's the big American model or a suite of American models, or you go and you look at the Bureau, which is the kind of nickname for the global weather model run out of the European Center for Medium Range Weather Forecasts, which at the time was in Reading, England. It's kind of been moving around a little bit since then. But the way it was quite striking to me how intimate that endeavor was on their part. There was what's one of the things that's special, one of the things that arguably makes the European model better than anyone else is the way in which they combine kind of operations with the research scientists together in one building, eating together in one cafeteria, having lots of coffees together, being good Europeans. And that was so my goal was to kind of go both see how the model improves on a month-to-month and year-to-year basis. So I timed my visit there with one of their quarterly review meetings, but then also see how it works on a kind of hourly or daily basis. So I also did this kind of weird sort of hallucination where I asked one of the people who knows how the model works best to essentially watch it run, to kind of open up the console on his desktop and explain to me as the indicators are going by on a given Tuesday afternoon what the model was doing, how it was going through going through its steps to take in the observations from the atmosphere all over the Earth from the most recent moments, and then speculate what that might be over the next 3 to 7 days, and sort of spit that out quite precisely. And so that was a kind of it was the nearest way possible to kind of look under the hood, but also to very carefully kind of choose the kind of altitude with which I was watching it. I wasn't going to look at the code. I didn't want the weather forecast. I wanted something in between. I wanted some steps of the process as legible as I could make them.
One of the as you were in the book, as you described that, you can almost imagine being in the room. You can get that sense of what it's like for, and in the cafeteria, how people sit down and have these conversations and sort of and transfer ideas from one mind to the other. And as I went through the book, because you write it's a great sort of historical arc as well, but it struck me how this is so much a story of collective intelligence, mm-hmm. of an enormously complex system being broken down and a combination of algorithms and massive compute and people and science and competition between mm-hmm. different elements coming together to actually really advance something that gives it has huge utility around the world. And it was, I think one of the things that really grabbed me about the book is that the story overall is this long arc of that journey and how it takes, there's almost an institution. There are institutions around this, not just the institutions of the National Weather Service, but the institutions of science, of how people communicate uncertainty and of how different norms sort of evolve over time. And I'm curious as how you look back on the research that you did and put it in today's context, and thinking about how like it's a story. It's a good story of optimism about what humans can do when you've got one particular goal, which is to like make the weather forecast better. I'm sort of trying to pull out the thing that makes me the most curious, which is how did you reflect on the way this whole system actually evolved and works and how it works today versus where it might work tomorrow?
Yeah. Well, there are a few things to think about there. One is that the book was essentially reported in the end of the Obama administration and written in the first half of the Trump administration. And so in the background of a kind of understanding of international cooperation, of a international scientific project, which weather meteorology utterly is, of privatization of American institutions, of the functioning of government. I mean, all of these kind of themes that are kind of in there was up against the backdrop of the early years. The book was finished writing December 2018, so really 2 full years of that. So I was thinking a lot about the ways in which the U.S. in particular in the years since World War II really kind of went on a kind of amazing both international and technological run. And that's explicit in the kind of story of meteorology. I love when the JFK speech, the Man on the Moon speech, putting a man on the moon is like bullet point 2. Launching a weather satellite is like bullet point 5. Everyone forgets about the weather satellite part. But it was completely part and parcel of a vision of technological and political supremacy and power that resulted, that was successful in meteorology. That sort of did create the systems and the government, or systems and the scientific and the government structures that sort of set the stage for the kind of improvement we're talking about. So I think that's, so for me, a lot of, the success of that was very much, a global effort, but really epitomized in so many ways, the space age, and the kind of technological run of the last 50 years, which as I was writing in 2017, 2018, did feel, elements of that felt under threat in certain ways.
Do you have any thoughts about where this goes? I mean, I'm thinking about the arc of weather forecasting. You mentioned, the 2-day forecasts in the 80s. I'm remembering my sort of earliest, most formative relationship with weather forecasting was at my family's summer home in Maine, and we had a little radio box, and it was dedicated to the weather, and you had to put up the antenna, and I remember it was tan. It had a really orange button, and you had to hit the orange button to hear the weather coming through from a guy, and I don't know where he was, but man, he had the thickest Maine accent, and he'd take you from Kennebunkport all the way up the coast and give you all the weather. And that was a thing that we had to do before we went out on the boat at any time, because you had to be able to get at least, and that was good enough. Like we weren't going out for multiple days. This was small, watercraft kind of stuff. So, but you had to go listen to that and got to make sure you knew what the weather was going to do, because at least in the next few hours while you were out, you had to be able to anticipate that. Now we've gotten to so much more level of sophistication. Obviously, I can just pull up my phone and look at it. But where does this go? Like, I'm thinking, do we have the ability to? Do you think we have the ability to continue to make? Today's 6-day forecast is going to be, someday it's going to be 16 days, or is there some other way that we experience these forecasts? And I know I'm asking you for the sort of the impossible of forecasting the future, but I guess since you wrote a book on forecasting, I get to ask.
Well, there are a few things to pick out there. One, I mean, the kind of where we are today, in comparison, it's a good point of contrast. If you're friends with any surfers, that they are, they're tuned into their own sort of special apps that are themselves plugged into the same, weather models that I'm writing about. But it's like, well, okay, at 4:00 the swell is going to start, and the wind, is going to be from this direction at precisely this mile per hour, and therefore the conditions are going to be good. And oh, by the way, I'm going to know that 4 days in advance. And that's a kind of, that is a remarkable leap that is incredibly useful to them. Obviously, there are many, there are many examples of the way in which the precision of that forecast is useful. So when I think about that, when I think about kind of where we're going, how much better the forecast could get, one of the things that I take from the meteorologists, and I say the meteorologists as a distinct kind of species from the weather modelers, from the kind of physicists who build the models, but when I say meteorologists, I'm talking about the people who are forecasting the weather for us, a kind of actionable forecast, not a kind of mathematical forecast. And in that case, a forecast is only as good as the decisions you can make with it. So the kind of archetypal example, which I love and I write about in the book, is, if you're having a party and you want to decide whether or not to rent a tent, then, when do you need to make that decision, and how sure do you need to be of that decision? And as I quote the famous folks at the European Center, if the Queen is coming to your party, you need to be more sure of that decision than if, any of your friends are coming to that party. And so then you're talking about perhaps a 3 or 4 day, forecast where that you really want to make sure it's going to rain or not. Then if you're running an airline, you have a different set of operations, different set of decisions to make. If you're planning a wedding 6 months in advance, yes, it would be nice to know which day it will be raining and which day it won't be. That's obviously not happening. 10 days in advance, though, we're starting to get in the ballpark. We kind of, at the moment, even this winter, we've had no snow in New York this winter. But a week, 8 days before I was taking a flight, in February, it's worth looking to see if there's some disturbance out there. And that becomes pretty clear. And, it's kind of wild to think about, making a personal decision for that, not based on, on a day's notice or 2 days notice, but based on 5 or 6 days notice, and what the stakes might be for that. So how do we get there? Well, I guess the first question is, how far do you want to go? What is really useful? Obviously a 10-day forecast for a hurricane with a great deal of confidence would be useful. People won't really necessarily act on it or believe it until much closer. But I think we're already kind of, frequently making, decisions based on that kind of forecast. And then you don't really have, you have limits of computation, you have limits of observation. The kind of, chaos theory is not really the limit. We kind of like to think that, it's impossible to predict, but that does not seem to be the limiting factor. We're kind of we've pushed through that already. But you do have sort of the basics of, if you're sampling a certain resolution of the atmosphere, and that there are inaccuracies, inherent to that. But regardless of kind of how far you go with that, it's really just like, it can't just be a math problem. It's an interesting math problem. It's a good math problem, but it has to be useful to someone. And for it to be useful, it has to have a certain confidence. Or you need an entire social science that builds up around it that is about decision making. That's about helping emergency managers understand what this is useful for. When they should be actually doing something actionable with a 7 or 8 day weather forecast, or a more dramatic 1 or 2 or 3 day forecast.
It's one of the areas where I think we sort of came to the subject around the role of artificial intelligence. Is part of the commonality is expressing uncertainty, and expressing it in a way that you help people make decisions based not on just the prediction, but also the uncertainty around prediction. And there's almost a little lab around weather forecasting to look at different ways to present uncertainty and get different reactions from people. And it certainly feels like that we're still struggling to sort of understand how to position and how to convey uncertainty in different ways, because, and especially with weather being a little bit, it seems more volatile, and people's reactions seem more volatile because expectations around how many hurricanes or how many natural events that are driven by weather, that people's expectations have changed because of climate change as well. Mm-hmm. And it's I'm interested in what you've reflected on in terms of this intersection of social science and using artificial intelligence to have smarter, more dynamic interfaces with either the the meteorologists or the emergency managers or right through to citizens about how to frame and help people understand that uncertainty?
I mean, it's very tricky. It's very consequential. I mean, there was this major storm in Buffalo in December, major snowstorm in Buffalo, New York, was a kind of particularly tragic example where the weather forecast was really good. But there's some kind of threshold by which the people of Buffalo, who are used to a lot of snow, kind of tune it out, and sort of breaking through and saying, this is that 10th, this is the time when you actually do have to stay home, rather than run to the store. It didn't happen, so the dozens of people that died. It's so kind of doing the things that they would do on a regular snowy night, without grasping that this was not a regular snowy night. And did the forecast kind of, on paper was correct, but was not received, with the danger, that it actually presented. And so that was pretty dramatic. So I kind of, that's an incredible, there's so much. I mean, I like the example because there's so much baked into it. It's like, if you don't have 4-wheel drive cars, you people have a different attitude. If you're talking about, if you're not in Buffalo and this storm is coming, it's a completely different attitude. There's just so many different things, that kind of go into the, if people are watching TV, do they hear it differently than if they have their weather radio versus if they're looking at their app? Are the apps putting in the right kind of signals, and warnings? We've all had the experience, I think, of seeing a kind of absurd warning, that's automatically generated that makes no sense. Sometimes the classic example in New York City is a sort of flash flood warning. It's always, everyone kind of chuckles when a flash flood warning comes through here. And, we did have that experience a couple of years ago of the same thing, of real catastrophic neighborhood flooding where people died, where you couldn't cross the street. That was absolutely out of the so far out of past experience, that it was a warning that was unheeded, because it was so far out of past experience was because it broke records by 2x, ostensibly because of new climatic extremes. So, I mean, there's an example where the technical system of the forecast is exactly right, because the weather models don't care about climate change. They take the amount of moisture in the atmosphere and calculate that forward. They're not constrained, as human meteorologists are, by past experience. But humans are constrained by past experience. And so, again, have a perfectly good technical forecast, but do not act on that, with deadly consequences. So these are, the collision of this, I think, is really fascinating. A very sort of, it's a narrow but specific thread in the broader conversation about AI, but I think is really interesting.
Oh, I think it's very interesting, and it is you're right. It is narrow, but it's something that everyone experiences. So it is a universal experience. I mean, no one goes through modern, at least digitally connected life without having some form of conversation about the weather forecast. It's going to come up, and it's getting more dramatic. But we live in a world now where the more and more AI that's coming into our lives, what are we getting flooded with? We're getting flooded with predictions because at least we're having this conversation about generative AI being different, but most, AI systems, what they're doing is they're predicting. And so what happens from that prediction is what judgments do we as humans make from that prediction, and then what actions do we take from those judgments? And what you've studied and covered and written about now is sort of this history of that, right? As the journey of weather forecasting became much more sophisticated, became longer form, there was longer predictions. People have experienced the fact that, the weather forecaster is always wrong. And what's interesting is even with that history, people still don't understand that a forecast will be wrong some percentage of the time. It is a prediction. And you could be right 90% of the time, and the only thing people are going to remember is the 10% that you were wrong when you said it was going to rain and it didn't, right? And so we still haven't adjusted, even on this one thing that we all universally experience. We haven't really adjusted to the fact that the machine's making a prediction that will hopefully be generally correct, but it will be wrong at some point, and we can't get that through our heads very well.
Well, we're not privy, at least on our basic apps, we're not privy to confidence. The apps don't sort of tell us, yes. and there's a real divide. I see this between as a taking my weather app seriously as a Weather Underground user. I don't know if any of you, this is like the more finely grained one compared to the stock. Exactly. Compared to this.
Every morning she starts by looking at it, but then she reads the entire scientific discussion, every morning. So
I have a cycle of somewhere between, winter more than summer, but somewhere between 6 and 9 tabs / apps that I have to go through before I, can start the day. Because I got to triangulate these things.
Well, so there's a great example. The scientific discussion, which I have spent a lot of time with, and actually I confess I don't look at it anymore. but that's so fascinating because you have the Weather Underground, which is essentially its own algorithm sitting on top of the global weather models. So the weather company is kind of post processing, as they say, and fine tuning the output of the global weather models for your specific location, and perhaps kind of clipping the edges, making it just seem a little bit, taking the extremes off a little bit, kind of doing things that they've determined people kind of receive better. And then this sort of Apple weather app or whatever it is going to even clip that even more. It's going to kind of smush out. If the models say it's going to start raining at 2:00, the app will say it's going to rain between 1 and 3. Just kind of sort of leaving a lot of specificity out with the hope of not being as wrong. But the scientific discussion is totally separate from that, because that's still the human meteorologists for the National Weather Service who are looking at the outputs of the models, not looking at the Weather Underground system, which is, again, sits on top of that, and then doing their kind of own determinations. And for years, especially in the early years that I was thinking about this, I would shudder every time the human meteorologist in scientific discussion would essentially second guess the models. Would sort of say, well, the models aren't a forecast, and I'm going to kind of redo the work of the models and tweak that accordingly. That's changed over the last decade, and they are less likely to do that because the models they have more faith in the models than they used to. But again, you still have the sort of human decision making component of it. You still have the very specific kind of cultural, contextual, a forecast for the night before Thanksgiving is going to have a different tone than the forecast for a random Tuesday, 2 weeks later. And that's, there's a lot of human communication involved in that, which is now, given the success of the technical system, can be thought of distinctly from the technical forecast itself, you might call it. And there's an effort on the part of meteorologists to begin to tease those apart, but it's taken a while, and it's taken, it required sort of eating a bit of crow with it and sort of recognizing that their kind of the meteorologists' hold on the technical forecast is perhaps reasonably ceded to the machines, or rather to their colleagues who make the machines rather than themselves.
Well, I've noticed in my obsessive reading of the scientific discussion that there's been a significant shift, even in the last few years, to talk much more about convergence in the models, which model the outcome they're favouring. It's gone much more European in the last couple of years. And to talk much more about, in fact, I think it's quite recent, much more about extreme indexes. This is going to be a 80 to 90% precipitation. It's on the index of, as a way of communicating that this is something that's out of the ordinary. And it's almost seemed, reading the discussion, that has become totally embraced. Like it's great now that we can communicate these indexes in that way. But it's still amusing to, because they put their names at the end, who it is. And
you are a serious student of this. I'm impressed.
Yes. I know these guys.
Right,
I know
right.
it, and some of them are funnier than others.
Which weather office is it?
Pendleton, in Oregon. Okay. And so that it's east side of the Cascades. It's a pretty big warning area because it's kind of like Washington all the way through to like southern Oregon, on the east side of the Cascades. And there's some places where there's I would say, weather hotspots, right? So you got the passes, and you're right, there's still a lot of different communication at the beginning of the season for winter. The warnings have a slightly different flavour to them if people aren't used to snow versus at the end. And there's weather hotspots like the Columbia Gorge. It's going to be windy, or Interstate 84, when that gets a big dump of snow in eastern Oregon. There's a lot of extra warnings. But, I kind of get to know their humour. There's definitely... So I've taken some screenshots of the more amusing. But, there's been a significant shift in the 10 years that I've been reading that, to explain uncertainty, to talk about the models, to talk about how the models are converging or not, to talk much more about confidence in the forecast at particular times. So it's I like watching this evolution.
So then you have, I think of the people for whom that's most actionable, not driver, through the gorge, but then of course the road crews, who are trying to on an hour by hour basis or day by daily basis, trying to figure out what kind of staffing they need, what kind of equipment they need, how to kind of keep how to respond to what's about to come, and then the kind of if it's really dumping, if there's a kind of for half an hour between rather than an hour that it was expected, that's bad. That's really consequential for travelers in the gorge, for example. So it's the discussions though are still they've become a bit of an artifact. I wonder who the primary audience is perceived to be for when they write. Yes.
Crazy ladies like this one. Yeah. So I'll have a different question. Away from
I'm not that crazy. Come on.
My weather nerdy wife is everywhere you look right now, conversation about AI. And I'm wondering if there are any sort of broader lessons that you think there are to take from this weather forecasting stuff, not just about the models and improvement, but especially around what we're talking about here, which is that sort of human interaction, right? So there's a layer where, as you say, people take it out, and through Apple, or something like that, they're trying to make it be as correct as possible without necessarily being as specific. There's other places where they're trying to be extremely specific. Like I would imagine in the surf forecast, they're really going for specificity, right? This is what the swell will be like at 4:00, on Tuesday. And for some of that, I can imagine that's pretty helpful. Like if you want to time Mavericks, you got a much better window for that these days than you did, 30 years ago.
And sell subscriptions to your app for $5 a month or whatever it is. Yeah, totally.
Exactly.
Yeah, we pay for snowforecast.com, which is the same as surf. It's same interface. It looks exactly the same. It's just one's snow and one's waves.
But then you have these layers of people interpreting, right? You have the one layer, which is I'm going to help you understand where I think the predictions are coming out of the model, and that's the sort of scientific discussion. You've got the societal thing, the governmental thing, the folks who are thinking about disaster preparedness. You've got the individual people. Do you have any thoughts about how to sort of take this ecosystem that you've studied so closely and make it a broader statement about how to think about AI?
Well, okay, so I've been holding this back, but I feel like it's time for me now to confess that I am like the worst person about AI. I'm not interested. Think it's boring. I'm just like, I was going to say thank you.
Welcome to the podcast.
I'm teasing, but when everybody went nuts in November or December, it just doesn't interest me. Like, what's wrong with me? Why do I not I just don't get it. And as someone who is professionally engaged with trying to understand technology. So I sort of like, and partly because it just, I in my defense, or to justify that, I'm fascinated by people. That is a sort of fundamental thing of a journalist. Fundamental thing of trying to write about the complexity of the world is to be fascinated by that complexity, which is so often rooted in people. So as I think about kind of the possibilities for AI with this. As much as I love the success of the weather models and prediction, and they are not AI by any stretch. There is some movement towards pushing them in that direction, which I frankly actually don't really understand. And it's just kind of like around the edges, I think. It's like, well, what if we make, these calculations a little fuzzier and, we let the system kind of figure itself out, rather than tell it precisely what to do, then that could generate a sort of better outcome in some form or another. But from a communication standpoint, I mean, we're still, there's got to be something between, telling the system to put a sun icon or a rain icon, or like the 3 gradations in between, versus the nuance of a human forecaster who might even know the road crew dispatcher who is reading the forecast on the other end of the line. There's got to be something in the middle there. There's certainly room for the kind of the kinds of complex problems that airlines face. There's certainly room for there, but I kind of, this is just me being a bit curmudgeonly, but I'm like, I don't really have a full grasp of where that goes from a algorithm as we kind of know them more specifically and something more self-generative in the way that we talk about AI. Like I don't really understand that threshold, particularly for technical things. For the kinds of emotional things we've been seeing with generative AI more recently, yes, obviously that gets a little creepy. But again, to be a bit curmudgeonly with it, it's like this is like a bad conversation. It's just like what it's like. This is like a machine approximating, what is less interesting than any given human conversation in my opinion. Anyway.
I think that a lot of the parallel is these social science aspects of how people respond to uncertainty, and looking at how people respond to uncertainty and other AI-driven predictions, whether it's like, I don't know, some sort of recommender or a medical diagnosis, or these kinds of applications that we're starting to actually get quite a lot of research out of, and understanding how that translates into how consumers might be able to make better decisions based on their own context and on the forecast itself. I can see that parallel. I can also see learning back the other way. It struck me, we're deep in this whole GPT world at the moment just because you kind of have to be. And there's very little that's making me feel particularly optimistic. If anything, this is forcing me into much more of a pessimistic mindset around AI.
Of its usefulness or its consequence?
Its consequences based on who owns it. Mm-hmm. You think about how one way of thinking about how this technology develops is to say, is to follow that line of technical development, societal development, regulation, data privacy, and then you look at how effectively we've managed to regulate that, and the answer is not very effectively at all. So that doesn't bode well for some sort of societal reaction or ability to control these giant language models, large language models, and how they're used in more nefarious ways, for example. But the weather machine actually does give a good example of where humans have taken, there's only a handful now of global models, and actually are making it work for good. Now, there's no agency inside the models. They aren't AI in the same way. But they the collective intelligence of the humans and machines together, and the way that humans are working, and the commitment to not just the hard physics and atmospheric science, but also the commitment to the social science of how meteorologists are changing their behaviours as these predictions become more granular, become more extreme, and watching how humans respond to that in the context of their lives. There's almost a little lab of positivity there, that we can work together.
With a huge caveat, and I'm not sure if this is where you were deliberately going with it, but with the huge caveat that the models and the forecasts as we primarily know it today have been public endeavors, have been the work of governments and the work of governments cooperating. We are at the early stages of a new era of the privatization of those weather models. And there's a lot of hype around this. A lot of folks who are essentially taking the existing models and existing observation infrastructure, global observation infrastructure, and adding a gloss on it that is offering a slight improvement, perhaps. It's not verified in the same way, so we don't really know how. It's hard to kind of measure that precisely. I mean, the Weather Underground app is a sort of basic example of that. Takes the weather model output and kind of gives a little bit of a shine to it in the way that is most useful to everyday people who are looking at the forecast for sort of everyday reasons. But then you have a sort of new crop of folks who are either using proprietary weather observations, either from sensors in cars, from their own private satellites. Weather satellites have been things that governments fly, and where the data is, as a matter of course, exchanged globally. If you have a proprietary weather satellite company, that's not a given to the same extent. And so you have a new set of companies that are leveraging new observations, leveraging some type of new, again, you can insert your word, algorithm, AI, model, whatever it is. Fundamentally, they're all kind of interfacing with the global models as we've been discussing them. But what you have as well is a business opportunity. You have an era of extreme weather that is making it potentially profitable to sell better weather forecasts or more carefully tailored weather forecasts. Where it gets tricky, of course, two reasons, two ways. One, you have the kind of kind of cracking of this global infrastructure of public good that has been sort of very painstakingly assembled in the last 50 years. So that's kind of it's a kind of philosophical concern. And then the second, a sort of moral concern is that you very likely and very immediately have better weather forecasts for people who are willing or can pay for them. And in an era of climatic extremes, you kind of already do have this. You have the ability for rich people to evacuate before poor people because they have their information sooner. And that's not a particularly abstract thing. That's a pretty literal thing. Everything is tied up in all sorts of other considerations. But fundamentally, the entire history of meteorology has been as a public science, and we're just at the very beginnings of it as a private technology.
So we're coming to the end here, but I did want to ask you. What can you tell us about what you're working on now? What's fascinating you now about humanity, and where are you? What are you working on?
It's a great question. A couple different threads of things. One which I haven't sort of talked about publicly much, but I've spent a lot of the last year working with the folks at the Engine, which is MIT's venture capital firm, essentially as a storyteller for some of their climate tech companies. That very much came out of the kind of the recognition that climate tech as a genre has an incredible amount of things happening, many of which are not yet quite baked, are still kind of in the future. But it sort of pushed me towards wanting to participate more than observe. It pushed me towards sort of stepping up, into these projects rather than sort of away from them with a journalistic move. So that's been absolutely fascinating. And their portfolio company and some of the folks I've gotten to work with to tell their stories, it's cancer drugs, one day, and new kinds of steel another. Another, wireless battery charging a third, all sorts of crazy things. So that kind of got me thinking about the things we're building at the moment. And then also brought me back to the topic that would seem inevitable for an infrastructure writer, which is we are ostensibly, and it's a little bit cloudy still. Whereas there's still a lot of static in the way that we see it, but we're ostensibly living through this, once in a century infrastructural revolution with the energy transition in some form or another. It's still diffuse. It's still sort of overwhelmed by a discussion of climate as a scientific thing, rather than decarbonization as an infrastructure project. Those two things I think are very convoluted with each other. Even as we talk now with the IPCC report yesterday, it's all about climate science. It strikes me that this is an infrastructure problem at this point, and it's and that infrastructure is much more my topic than climate science, and they're totally intertwined at the moment. So I have been thinking hard about how to tell that story of the energy transition, and the way in which it is unevenly distributed, as so many kind of forward-looking things are. And trying to understand, would it be possible to see it as complete in some places in a way that's instructive toward understanding how it is incomplete or behind schedule in other places?
Well, that is an entirely separate episode, if not an entire series that we could embark with you on, given the fact that both of us spent time, quite a lot of time in the energy space and in what was, the original clean tech wave of innovation a long time ago. Well, thank you very much for joining us. This was a heck of a lot of fun, and I'm looking forward to Helen pulling up the scientific discussion and reflecting on this conversation as she's reading the scientific forecast every morning now.
Well, I wouldn't read it if it wasn't useful.
Exactly.
They're actually pretty good.
Exactly. Thank you very much. It's been a great pleasure to talk to you.
Likewise, I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoy our podcast, please subscribe on Substack or your favorite podcast platform. And please leave a positive rating or comment. Sharing your positive feedback helps us reach more people and connect them with the world's great minds. Seriously, a review on Apple Podcasts is a big deal. And if you like how we think, then contact us about our speaking and workshops and human-centered product design. You can learn more about us at getsonder.com, and you can contact us at hello@getsonder.com. You can learn more about making better decisions in our book, Make Better Decisions, How to Improve Your Decision-Making in the Digital Age. The book is an essential guide to practicing the cognitive skills needed for making better decisions in the age of data, algorithms, and AI. Please check it out at mbd.zone, on Amazon, bookshop.org, or place an order through your favorite local bookstore.
Stay